The chainsaw's scream died at exactly 3:47 a.m. on October 13, 1978, leaving only the mountain's breathing silence. Federal agents would later mark this as the precise moment an entire family simply ceased to exist. What happened in those final hours would force the FBI to classify an entire case file under a designation so rare that only 12 other incidents in American history carry the same black stamp. The Blackridge family compound sat like a wound carved into the Virginia mountains, where Ravens Hollow twisted through coal dark valleys that swallowed sound. Here, the morning mist carried more than moisture. It carried secrets that had fermented in these hills for over a century. The scent of burning oak mixed with something metallic, something that made seasoned federal agents reach for their sidearms before they understood why. Pine needles crunched underfoot with a brittle snap of broken promises, and every surface from rusted mailboxes to weather-beaten porch rails felt slick with a dampness that never quite dried. Sophronia Blackridge ruled this domain with the quiet authority of someone who understood that true power whispered rather than shouted. At 63, she moved through her mountain kingdom like smoke through trees, present everywhere and nowhere, her pale eyes cataloging every soul who dared venture up the winding dirt road that led to their door. Those who knew her, and precious few, claimed that privilege spoke of her in the hushed tones reserved for natural disasters and divine retribution. The compound itself defied easy description. Federal surveyor maps from 1976 showed a modest farmhouse with 2 outbuildings. Satellite imagery revealed something far more complex. A labyrinth of structures connected by covered walkways, root cellars that burrowed impossibly deep, and storage sheds arranged in patterns that seemed random until viewed from above. Then the geometry became clear, each building positioned to provide perfect sightlines while creating blind spots where unwanted visitors might simply disappear. Some families passed down recipes or furniture. Reginald Blackvale, Sophronia's eldest son, had inherited something far more valuable, an understanding of how to make problems vanish without a trace. Local Sheriff's Deputy Marcus Webb would later testify that calls to Ravens Hollow were met with a peculiar response, not hostility, but a kind of cooperative helpfulness that somehow discouraged further questions. "They'd answer anything you asked," Webb recalled during his federal deposition, "but they'd answer it in a way that made you forget why you'd asked in the first place." The pattern had remained consistent for decades. Missing persons reports that originated near the Blackridge property would be thoroughly investigated, meticulously documented, then quietly archived as cold cases. Hikers who strayed from marked trails, traveling salesmen who took wrong turns, even the occasional federal census taker who knocked on the wrong door at the wrong time. Clementine Ashbrook, the family's unofficial spokesperson, possessed a remarkable talent for providing detailed answers that revealed nothing. When questioned about the unusual number of vehicles that traveled their private road at odd hours, she explained with perfect sincerity about their thriving herb business. Night harvests, she'd say, were essential for maintaining potency. The moonlight preserved certain medicinal properties that daylight destroyed. Her explanations were so thorough, so earnestly delivered, that investigators found themselves nodding along even as their instincts screamed warnings. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a 70-year-old moonshiner named Tobias Ravenston, who'd spent his entire life in these mountains. On September 29, 1978, Tobias stumbled into the Grundy Police Department with a mason jar clutched in his trembling hands. Inside that jar, preserved in clear-grain alcohol, was something that would change everything the authorities thought they knew about the Blackridge family. File 17-4799, Evidence Log Entry Number 1. Read the official report. Single human molar, aged approximately 12 to 14 years, displaying signs of deliberate extraction. Recovery location: Ravens Hollow Creek, approximately 2 miles downstream from the Blackridge property. But Tobias hadn't just brought evidence. He'd brought a story that made even hardened mountain lawmen reach for the bottle. For 3 generations, he claimed, his family had run illegal liquor through these valleys. They knew every cave, every hidden spring, every game trail that snaked through the wilderness, and they knew to avoid Raven's Hollow after dark. "My granddaddy told me," Tobias whispered to Detective Sarah Martinez, his voice barely audible above the station's fluorescent hum. "He said there were sounds coming from that place that weren't made by any animal God intended to walk this earth. And he said, sometimes you'd see lights moving through the trees in patterns that didn't make sense, like they were following something that was running." The federal investigation officially began on October 1st, 1978. 3 days later, Special Agent David Cromwell would file a preliminary report that used phrases like unprecedented cooperation and highly unusual family dynamic. By October 10th, those same reports had shifted to terms like coordinated obstruction and possible conspiracy. Then came the silence. But what the agents discovered in those final 72 hours would forever change how the federal government approached cases involving isolated communities and family secrets that ran deeper than blood. The question wasn't whether the Blackridge family had committed crimes. The evidence for that was overwhelming and undeniable. The question was how they'd managed to make an entire federal investigation team question their own sanity, and why seasoned agents with decades of experience would later refuse to discuss what they'd seen in those final hours before the chainsaw stopped screaming and the mountain swallowed its secrets whole. Agent David Cromwell's government-issued sedan coughed black exhaust as it climbed the final switchback toward Raven's Hollow, the engine straining against an incline that seemed to grow steeper with every mile. His partner, Agent Elena Vasquez, pressed her palm against the passenger window and watched the tree line close in like a fist. The federal government had sent its best, but even the best couldn't have prepared for what awaited them in those mist-shrouded mountains, where civilization thinned to nothing and family law held more weight than federal jurisdiction. The morning of October 2nd, 1978, brought the kind of crystalline mountain air that made every sound carry for miles. Wood smoke drifted from the Blackridge chimney, mixing with the earthy rot of autumn leaves, and something else, a sweet, cloying scent that reminded Cromwell of the rendering plant outside his childhood home in Nebraska. Gravel crunched under their tires with the deliberate slowness of an approaching funeral procession, and every surface they touched felt somehow too warm, as if the mountain itself was running a fever. The agents had arrived with a simple mandate: investigate reports of suspicious activity and determine whether federal intervention was warranted, standard procedure for isolated communities that attracted too many missing person reports. What they found instead was a masterclass in psychological manipulation that would be studied in federal training academies for decades to come. Sophronia Blackridge met them at the compound's main gate with the serene composure of someone expecting honored guests. She wore a simple blue house dress and practical boots, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. Nothing about her appearance suggested anything more threatening than a church librarian. When she smiled, the expression reached her eyes, and that, Agent Vasquez would later note in her debriefing, was the first warning sign they chose to ignore. "Gentlemen, ma'am," Sophronia said, her mountain accent soft as morning mist. "We've been expecting you. Coffee's fresh, and I believe you'll find we have nothing to hide." The compound tour lasted 3 hours. Sophronia guided them through every building, opened every door, answered every question with the kind of transparent honesty that made both agents unconsciously relax their guard. The main house revealed nothing more sinister than outdated furniture and family photographs spanning generations. The workshop contained standard farming equipment, well-maintained and properly stored. Even the root cellars showed exactly what they claimed to contain: preserved vegetables, home-canned goods, and neat rows of mason jars filled with herbs and medicinal tinctures. Federal Investigation Report, Day 1. Agent Cromwell wrote that evening. Initial assessment reveals a close-knit family engaged in subsistence farming and herbal medicine production. Subjects demonstrate unusual level of cooperation and transparency. No evidence of criminal activity observed during preliminary inspection. But cooperation, they would learn, could be its own form of deception. Reginald Blackvale emerged from the tree line just as the agents were preparing to leave, his hunting rifle broken open and carried safely across his forearm. Tall and lean with his mother's pale eyes, he possessed the quiet confidence of someone completely at home in his environment. When he spoke, his voice carried the same mountain cadence as Sophronia's, but underneath lay something harder, the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Heard we had visitors," he said, extending a calloused hand to each agent in turn. "Hope Mother's been taking proper care of you. These mountains can be unwelcoming to strangers who don't understand our ways." Agent Vasquez felt something cold settle in her stomach at those words, though she couldn't articulate why. Later, during her psychological evaluation, she would describe the sensation as recognition without understanding. Like my subconscious was screaming warnings, my conscious mind refused to hear. The family dinner invitation came as the agents reached their vehicle. Clementine Ashbrook, introduced as Sophronia's daughter-in-law, appeared in the doorway with flour-dusted hands and the kind of genuine smile that made refusal seem not just rude, but almost cruel. "We don't get many visitors this far up the mountain," she said, her voice carrying just the right note of lonely hospitality. "It would be an honor to share our table with federal agents. Besides, the road down gets treacherous after dark, and weather's turning." They knew not to trust her. As if summoned by her words, clouds began massing over the western peaks, promising the kind of sudden mountain storm that could turn dirt roads into impassable mud trenches. The agents exchanged glances, conducting an entire conversation in the space of a heartbeat. Standard protocol demanded they maintain professional distance, but standard protocol hadn't anticipated the Blackridge family's particular brand of persuasion. The dinner table could have come from a Norman Rockwell painting: checkered tablecloth, mismatched chairs, steaming bowls of stew surrounded by fresh bread and mason jars of sweet tea. 7 family members gathered around the worn wooden surface, their faces lit by the warm glow of kerosene lamps. The conversation flowed as naturally as creek water, touching on weather patterns, federal programs for rural communities, and the challenges of maintaining mountain traditions in a modern world. Agent Cromwell found himself genuinely enjoying the evening, charmed by stories of local folklore and impressed by the family's encyclopedic knowledge of mountain ecology. Agent Vasquez struggled with a growing sense of unease that she couldn't rationally justify. The food was excellent, the company engaging, and their hosts demonstrated the kind of old-fashioned hospitality that seemed increasingly rare in 1970s America. It wasn't until they prepared to leave the storm having passed and the road declared safe for travel that the evening's only jarring note occurred. As Agent Vasquez shook hands with each family member, she noticed something that would haunt her dreams for weeks afterward. Every single person at that table had identical pale scars on their left ring finger, as if something had once been removed with surgical precision. When she mentioned this observation to Agent Cromwell during their drive down the mountain, he was quiet for several minutes before responding. "I noticed something too," he finally said. "Did you count the place settings when we first sat down?" 7, Vasquez replied without hesitation. "Why? Count again in your memory. Count carefully." She did, visualizing the table in detail, and felt her blood chill as she realized the truth. There had been 8 place settings when they arrived, but only 7 people had joined them for dinner. Who had they been expecting that never came? And where exactly had that 8th person gone? The telephone in Agent Cromwell's motel room rang at exactly 2:37 a.m., its shrill cry cutting through the mountain silence like a blade through silk. When he answered, Only breathing filled the line, measured, deliberate, and somehow familiar. This wasn't a wrong number or a prank call, and both agents knew it. Someone was sending them a message, wrapped in the kind of psychological warfare that turned routine investigations into career-ending nightmares. The Blue Ridge Motor Lodge sat 8 miles down the mountain from Ravens Hollow, its neon sign flickering against the October darkness like a dying heartbeat. The smell of stale cigarettes and industrial disinfectant permeated every surface, while outside, night sounds carried differently than they should too. Muffled, too careful, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Even the bedsheets felt wrong beneath their fingers, rough with a texture that suggested they'd been washed in something stronger than regular detergent. Agent Vasquez had been dreaming of place settings when her own phone rang 30 seconds after Cromwell's call ended. Same pattern: breathing, recognition, silence. She found herself sitting upright in bed, heart hammering against her ribs, trying to shake the sensation that invisible eyes were cataloging her every movement. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Internal memo. October 3, 1978. She would later dictate to her supervisor, subjects demonstrate sophisticated understanding of psychological pressure tactics. Recommend immediate consultation with Behavioral Analysis Unit. But behavioral analysis was 3 days away, and the Blackridge family was just getting started. The morning brought visitors a parade of local residents who seemed to materialize from the mountain mist with the specific purpose of vouching for the family's character. Mortimer Fenridge, the elderly postmaster, arrived first with a thermos of coffee and 40 years' worth of stories about Sophronia's kindness to struggling neighbors. Leonora Whitcomb, who ran the general store, followed with fresh biscuits and tales of how the Blackridge family had single-handedly kept her business afloat during the recession of 1975. Each visitor carried the same message, wrapped in different words. The Blackridge family were pillars of the community, generous with their time and resources, and absolutely essential to the mountain's survival. More importantly, each visitor somehow knew exactly where the federal agents were staying and precisely when to arrive for maximum impact. Coordination, Agent Cromwell noted in his field report. Every conversation feels rehearsed, but rehearsed by people who are genuinely convinced of what they're saying. Either we're dealing with mass delusion, or we're witnessing the most sophisticated community-wide cover-up in Bureau history. The pattern interrupted itself around noon when Josiah Bramblewell approached their table at Mabel's Diner. Unlike the other visitors, Josiah carried no offerings and spoke in whispers that barely carried over the coffee shop's ambient noise. "They don't know everything. You federal boys seem like decent folks," he said, stirring his coffee with hands that trembled just enough to create tiny ripples across the surface. "Figured someone ought to tell you about the Henderson family." The Henderson family had lived in Ravens Hollow from 1947 to 1973. 4 generations spanning from grandparents to newborn twins, they'd maintained a small dairy farm on the eastern slope of the valley. Good neighbors, regular churchgoers, the kind of people who sent Christmas cards and attended every community gathering. Then, they'd simply vanished. Not moved away, Josiah clarified, his voice dropping even lower. Vanished. Left everything behind: livestock, furniture, even the coffee still warm on the kitchen table. Sheriff ruled it a voluntary disappearance, said they must have had debts or family troubles. But I helped with the cleanup crew, and I saw things that didn't make sense. The details emerged slowly. Josiah glancing repeatedly at the diner's windows as if expecting unwelcome observers. Personal belongings left scattered, as if interrupted mid-activity. Meals half prepared and abandoned. Children's toys arranged in patterns that suggested interrupted play rather than deliberate departure. Strangest thing was the basement, Josiah continued. Found these mason jars lined up on shelves, each one labeled with a name and date. Henderson family names, but the dates went back further than any of them had been alive. like someone was keeping track of something that spanned generations. Agent Vasquez felt the familiar chills settle in her stomach. "Where are those jars now?" "Sophronia Blackridge offered to dispose of them," Josiah replied. "Said it wasn't right to leave such personal items for strangers to find." Real thoughtful of her, everyone agreed. After Josiah left, the agent sat in silence, watching the afternoon shadows lengthen across the diner's checkered linoleum. Outside, normal mountain life continued its rhythm. Pickup trucks navigating the winding roads, children waiting for school buses, elderly residents gathering on storefront porches to discuss weather and gossip. But beneath the surface normalcy, something else was happening. Phone calls were being made, messages passed, and decisions reached through a network of communication that operated below federal detection. The agents could feel it like pressure in their ears, the sense of being subjects in an experiment whose parameters they couldn't understand. That evening, Agent Cromwell received an official message from Bureau headquarters. Investigation timeline extended indefinitely. Additional resources being allocated. Do not, repeat, do not take any aggressive action without direct authorization from Deputy Director Morrison personally. The message had been sent before they'd filed their latest reports, before they'd requested additional resources, and before they'd indicated that aggressive action might become necessary. Someone with significant federal access was monitoring their investigation in real time, but the question that kept both agents awake that third night wasn't who was watching them from Washington. The question was, how had the Blackridge family managed to place someone so highly positioned within the federal bureaucracy? And what exactly were they protecting that required such extraordinary measures? The basement door creaked open at 4:15 a.m. on October 5th, revealing darkness so complete it seemed to absorb the agent's flashlight beams like liquid ink. Agent Vasquez descended first, her service weapon drawn, while somewhere above them, the Blackridge house settled into the kind of silence that suggested sleeping occupants who weren't really sleeping. What they discovered in those subterranean chambers would force the federal government to create an entirely new classification system for organized crime families operating in rural America. The air below ground carried scents that didn't belong in any legitimate basement. Industrial bleach mixed with copper pennies, and underneath it all, the sweet rot of organic matter in various stages of decomposition. Concrete floors had been poured with surgical precision, sloping gently toward drains that connected to a network of pipes disappearing into the mountain's depths. Every surface felt cold and slightly damp, as if the basement existed in perpetual winter regardless of the season above. Lucian Ashwortham, Clementine's brother, had provided them with access through a combination of conscience and terror that took 3 hours of careful negotiation to extract. Chain-smoking cigarettes in the diner parking lot, he'd finally broken his family's code of silence with words that tumbled out like a confession in an empty church. "They call it the network," he'd whispered, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line for signs of observation. Families scattered across 7 states, all connected, all serving the same purpose. We're just one link in a chain that goes back further than anyone wants to admit. The network operated on principles that would have impressed organized crime syndicates in major cities. Each family unit controlled specific territory and maintained detailed records of every person who entered their domain. Missing persons weren't random victims. They were carefully selected based on criteria that included social connections, likelihood of being missed, and what Lucian termed practical considerations that he refused to elaborate upon. But the Blackridge family served as more than just another regional cell. Agent Cromwell's flashlight beam caught something that made his blood chill. Filing cabinets stretching along an entire basement wall, each drawer meticulously labeled with years spanning from 1923 to 1978. Inside, manila folders contained detailed dossiers on hundreds of individuals, photographs, personal histories, family connections, and handwritten notes documenting their ultimate disposition. Federal Evidence Log, Item 47B. Agent Vasquez would later dictate approximately 300 case files documenting systematic targeting and elimination of individuals across multiple state jurisdictions. Files demonstrate sophisticated intelligence gathering and coordination between multiple family units operating under unified command structure. The Henderson family file was 18 pages thick. Photographs showed them engaged in normal activities, working their dairy farm, attending church picnics, celebrating birthdays. But each image had been taken from concealed positions using telephoto lenses. Someone had been watching the Henderson family for months before they vanished, cataloging their routines with the patience of a professional surveillance operation. At the bottom of their file, a single handwritten note in Sophronia's elegant script. Relocation completed October 15, 1973. Assets distributed according to protocol. Site prepared for next assignment. Verity Ravensley, the youngest family member at 19, had been the network's record keeper. Her bedroom, which the agents had briefly glimpsed during their initial tour, contained the kind of organizational system that would have impressed federal accountants. Ledgers tracked resource allocation, territory assignments, and what appeared to be a complex barter system between network families. Firearms traded for medical supplies, vehicles exchanged for specialized equipment, and most disturbingly, human resources transferred between locations based on operational needs. The scope became clear when Agent Cromwell discovered a wall map marked with red pins across Virginia, West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Each pin corresponded to a family name written in Verity's careful handwriting. The Blackridge compound wasn't an isolated anomaly. It was headquarters for a criminal organization that had been operating undetected for over 5 decades. Some secrets are too big to bury, but the discovery that would ultimately seal the family's fate wasn't found in filing cabinets or record books. It was found in Alaric Dunsworth's workshop, hidden behind a false wall that revealed equipment no legitimate mountain family would ever possess. Industrial-grade bone saws, chemical vats designed for processing organic matter, and a series of metal tables equipped with restraint systems and drainage channels. Most chilling of all was the appointment calendar hanging above the main work table. October 13th was circled in red ink, with a single notation: Federal Disposal, Sunrise Protocol. The agents had stumbled onto something that challenged every assumption about rural crime and family loyalty. The Blackridge network wasn't simply eliminating random victims. They were providing specialized services to clients who required individuals to disappear without trace. Federal investigators, nosy journalists, potential witnesses, even family members who threatened to expose ongoing operations. Agent Vasquez realized they'd been marked for elimination before they'd even arrived at Raven's Hollow. Every moment of apparent cooperation, every friendly gesture, every demonstration of transparency had been calculated steps in a process that would culminate with their own permanent disappearance. The only question remaining was whether they could escape the mountains alive or whether they would become the next entries in Verity Ravensley's meticulous ledgers. When they emerged from the basement at 5:43 a.m., they found Sophronia Blackridge waiting in the kitchen, calmly preparing breakfast, as if federal agents breaking into her home in the middle of the night was a perfectly normal occurrence. But what truly terrified them wasn't her composure. It was the fact that she'd set the table for exactly 10 people, though only 7 family members supposedly lived in the house. Who were the other 3 place settings meant for? And why did Agent Cromwell recognize his own service weapon lying casually beside one of the empty plates? Agent Cromwell's radio crackled to life at 6:12 a.m. with a voice he didn't recognize, speaking in code phrases that weren't part of any bureau protocol he'd ever learned. The transmission lasted exactly 30 seconds before dissolving into static, but the message was unmistakable. Abort the investigation and await extraction at coordinates that place them deep in network territory. Someone within the federal government had been compromised, and the agents now faced an enemy that operated from both the mountains of Virginia and the corridors of power in Washington, D.C. The morning air outside the Blackridge compound tasted of diesel fumes and wet leaves, carrying the mechanical hum of generators that shouldn't exist in a settlement supposedly powered by kerosene lamps and wood stoves. Frost crunched beneath their feet with the brittle snap of breaking promises, and every shadow seemed to conceal watchers whose patience had transformed waiting into an art form. The agents moved with the careful precision of prey animals who'd finally recognized their predators. Sophronia's breakfast invitation followed them out of the house like a lingering fragrance. She'd spoken only once during their hasty exit. "Safe travels, gentlemen, ma'am. The mountains can be treacherous for those who lose their way." Her tone had carried the casual warmth of a concerned hostess, but her eyes held the cold calculation of someone marking time until an inevitable conclusion. The drive down the mountain became a masterclass in psychological warfare. Every curve revealed vehicles that shouldn't have been there. Park service trucks with tinted windows, telephone company vans working on lines that carried no visible damage, even an ambulance idling at a scenic overlook with its crew reading newspapers while maintaining radio contact with unknown parties. Federal Field Report, October 5th. Urgent classification. Agent Vasquez dictated into her portable recorder. Network demonstrates command structure extending beyond immediate family unit. Evidence suggests federal infiltration at multiple levels. Request immediate secure extraction and forensic audit of all personnel with access to case files. But secure extraction was exactly what they wouldn't receive. Agent Cromwell's attempt to contact Bureau headquarters through normal channels resulted in a conversation that chilled him more thoroughly than any mountain morning. Deputy Director Morrison's secretary, a woman he'd known for 8 years, claimed no knowledge of the Ravens Hollow investigation. More disturbing, she insisted that no agents had been assigned to rural Virginia and that his current location was listed as administrative leave pending psychological evaluation. According to official federal records, David Cromwell and Elena Vasquez didn't exist. Marcella Thornbridge had been expecting their visit to her house in town. The network's intelligence coordinator possessed the deceptive appearance of a retired school teacher, silver hair in a neat bun, wire-rimmed spectacles, and a cardigan that had seen better decades. But her living room contained communication equipment that would have impressed military intelligence units, and her knowledge of federal procedures suggested years of careful study. Agents Cromwell and Vasquez, she said, offering tea with the practiced courtesy of someone accustomed to difficult conversations. "Please, sit. We need to discuss your situation with complete honesty." The truth emerged over the course of 2 hours, delivered with the matter-of-fact tone of someone reading grocery lists. The network had been placing operatives within federal agencies since the 1940s, carefully building influence through strategic marriages, career guidance, and the kind of patient cultivation that turned government employees into unwitting assets, not corruption in any traditional sense, something far more sophisticated. They grew their own agents. Children born into network families were raised with dual loyalties from birth. The brightest were encouraged toward federal careers, provided with impeccable credentials, and positioned to rise through the bureaucratic ranks while maintaining absolute loyalty to their mountain origins. Over 3 decades, this strategy had placed network assets in positions ranging from regional field offices to senior leadership positions within the Justice Department. "Your investigation was authorized," Marcella explained, stirring her tea with movements that suggested barely controlled violence, "but authorized by people who wanted you to find exactly what you found, so they could test response protocols for a larger operation." The larger operation involved systematic elimination of federal oversight in rural regions across 7 states. Local law enforcement had already been neutralized through a combination of intimidation, corruption, and strategic replacement with network sympathizers. Federal investigation was the final obstacle to complete operational freedom. Agent Vasquez realized they'd been selected not for their investigative skills, but for their expendability. 2 agents with solid records, but no powerful political connections, working a case file that would disappear along with their bodies. Their deaths would be attributed to a tragic accident during a routine investigation, perhaps a vehicle crash on treacherous mountain roads, or a hiking mishap in remote wilderness areas known for claiming unprepared visitors. What you need to understand, Marcella continued, is that this isn't personal. The network serves purposes larger than individual survival. We preserve traditions, maintain social order in regions the federal government has abandoned, and provide services that official channels cannot acknowledge. When pressed for details about these services, Marcella's expression shifted from grandmotherly warmth to something far colder. Disposal, she said simply. Individuals whose continued existence creates problems for people with significant resources and unlimited patience. The scope was staggering. Corporate executives who discovered inconvenient safety violations, journalists investigating stories that powerful interests preferred buried, even federal agents whose investigations threatened operations spanning multiple states, all disappeared without trace, their elimination made possible by a network that had spent 50 years perfecting the art of making people vanish. But the network's greatest strength, their invisibility, was also their greatest vulnerability. They'd grown complacent, certain that federal investigation could be controlled or eliminated as needed. What they hadn't anticipated was agents who would refuse to follow protocol, who would risk everything to expose a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government. As if summoned by their growing desperation, Tobias Ravensden appeared at Marcella's back door with news that would either save their lives or seal their doom. A federal extraction team was already en route to Ravens Hollow, but they weren't coming to rescue anyone. They were coming to complete the cleanup operation that would eliminate all evidence of the network's existence, including the 2 agents who discovered too much truth for their own survival. The first gunshot shattered the mountain silence at exactly 9:47 a.m., followed by the mechanical click of rifle bolts engaging and the distant growl of engines moving through forest roads that weren't supposed to exist. Agent Cromwell pressed his back against the cold stone of Tobias Ravensden's root cellar and realized that 50 years of federal training had never prepared him for this moment. The hunters had become the hunted, and the mountains themselves had turned into a killing ground where every shadow concealed death and every familiar sound had transformed into a threat signal. The cellar smelled of damp earth and preserved vegetables, carrying undertones of motor oil and cordite that suggested Tobias had been preparing for this confrontation far longer than any of them realized. Wooden shelves lined rough stone walls, but instead of mason jars filled with pickled goods, they held ammunition boxes, field medical supplies, and communication equipment that looked military surplus. Above them, boots moved across floorboards with the measured cadence of professional searchers who knew their quarry was trapped and had nowhere to run. Agent Vasquez crouched beside a ventilation grate that provided a narrow view of the clearing around Tobias's cabin. Through the metal slats, she counted at least 12 figures moving through the tree line, too many for a standard federal extraction team, too well equipped for local law enforcement. These were specialists, brought in to handle a situation that had escalated beyond normal parameters. "Network cleanup protocol," Tobias whispered, his weathered hands checking the action on a hunting rifle that had seen decades of mountain warfare. "They're not here to arrest anybody. They're here to erase the problem completely." The problem included everyone who'd learned about the network's existence: federal agents, local informants, even longtime residents who'd asked too many questions or demonstrated insufficient loyalty to the mountain's unwritten laws. What had begun as a routine investigation had triggered a purge that would leave Ravens Hollow completely depopulated except for core family members whose silence was guaranteed by blood and fear. Cleanup meant elimination without witnesses, Agent Cromwell's radio produced only static when he attempted to contact legitimate federal authorities, but occasionally voices broke through coordinated communications between hunting teams that spoke in tactical shorthand about grid searches, elimination zones, and disposal protocols. The voices belonged to people who understood federal procedures well enough to mimic authentic operations while pursuing objectives that had nothing to do with law enforcement. Outside, engines moved with the deliberate pattern of a coordinated sweep. Vehicles had been positioned at every possible escape route down the mountain, while foot patrols worked systematically through forest areas where desperate fugitives might attempt to hide. The operation demonstrated the kind of planning that required weeks of preparation and resources that extended far beyond what any single criminal family should possess. But Tobias had spent 70 years in these mountains, and 70 years had taught him secrets that even the network didn't fully understand. "There's passages," he said, pointing toward what appeared to be a solid stone wall at the cellar's rear. "Old coal mine shafts that connect to natural cave systems. Network knows about some of them, but not all. My grandfather worked these tunnels during Prohibition, and he showed me routes that ain't on any map." The hidden entrance opened with the scrape of stone against stone, revealing darkness that stretched beyond the reach of their flashlights. The air flowing from the passage carried scents of deep earth and flowing water, along with something else, the faint chemical tang of explosives that Tobias had positioned at strategic points throughout the tunnel system. "Insurance policy," he explained, shouldering a pack that contained enough demolition materials to collapse several mountainsides. "Network thinks they control these mountains, but mountains got their own ideas about who belongs and who don't." The underground journey became a nightmare descent through passages that seemed to narrow with each step. Their flashlight beams revealed limestone walls carved by centuries of flowing water, occasional glimpses of rusted mining equipment, and the scattered bones of animals that had lost their way in the darkness and never found daylight again. Every sound echoed with distorted amplification that made whispers sound like shouts and footsteps like approaching thunder. Agent Vasquez realized they were moving through a subterranean highway that connected multiple mountain communities, a network beneath the network that predated federal authority by generations. These tunnels had hidden moonshiners during Prohibition, Confederate sympathizers during Reconstruction, and now they concealed the last witnesses to a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government. They emerged 3 miles from Tobias's cabin, surfacing through a concealed entrance behind an abandoned church that had been slowly reclaimed by mountain vegetation. The morning sun felt alien after the tunnel's perpetual darkness, and the normal sounds of birds and wind seemed impossibly loud after hours of subterranean silence. But normal no longer existed in Raven's Hollow. Smoke rose from multiple locations throughout the valley. Not the familiar wood smoke of morning fires, but the thick black columns that meant structures were burning with accelerants designed to eliminate evidence. The network was implementing scorched earth tactics, destroying everything that might provide clues about their operations or evidence of their crimes. Through binoculars salvaged from Tobias's emergency cache, Agent Cromwell watched uniformed figures moving through the ruins with military precision. They weren't wearing FBI jackets or carrying standard federal equipment. These were private contractors brought in to handle operations that official agencies couldn't acknowledge. The realization struck like cold water. There would be no federal rescue, no cavalry arriving at the last moment, no return to normal life after filing reports and attending debriefings. The network's infiltration of federal agencies was complete enough to ensure that official rescue would never come, and unofficial rescue was exactly what was hunting them through the mountains. Tobias checked his watch with the grim satisfaction of someone whose predictions were proving accurate on schedule. "Noon," he said simply. "That's when they start the final sweep. Everything that can walk or crawl gets eliminated, and then they burn what's left." But what the network hadn't anticipated was that some mountains hold secrets older and more dangerous than criminal conspiracies, and some residents had been preparing for this war since before the first federal agent set foot in Appalachian territory. The real battle was about to begin, and only one side understood that survival might require choices that would haunt the mountains for generations to come. The explosions began at exactly 12:03 p.m., rolling through the valley like thunder that never quite ended, each detonation triggering avalanches that would reshape the topography of Ravens Hollow forever. Agent Cromwell felt the ground shudder beneath his boots and realized that Tobias Ravenston hadn't just been planning their escape. He'd been preparing to bury the network's secrets so deep that no amount of federal investigation would ever unearth them. What happened in the next 47 minutes would be classified at levels so high that even presidents would never learn the complete truth, but it would also ensure that the Blackridge family's reign of terror ended exactly where it had begun, in the mountains that had sheltered their crimes for over half a century. The sound of collapsing tunnels mixed with screaming engines as network cleanup teams realized their carefully planned operation was disintegrating into chaos. Dust clouds rose from multiple locations throughout the valley, marking where underground charges had severed crucial passages and trapped hunting parties in dead-end caverns that would become their tombs. The mountain was literally swallowing the evidence, along with anyone unfortunate enough to be standing in the wrong place when Tobias triggered his insurance policy. Agent Vasquez crouched behind a fallen oak tree, watching through binoculars as uniformed figures scrambled between burning buildings that contained 50 years of accumulated records. The network's meticulous documentation, their greatest strength during decades of successful operation, had become their fatal weakness when those same files became evidence that could expose the conspiracy's true scope. But Sophronia Blackridge had survived 7 decades in these mountains. By understanding that even the best laid plans required contingencies built upon contingencies. Federal Emergency Transmission. October 13, 1978. Agent Cromwell dictated into his damaged radio, hoping someone, somewhere in legitimate government was still monitoring federal frequencies. Network leadership has initiated complete elimination protocol. Estimate 40+ casualties, including federal personnel. Mountain access will be compromised indefinitely. This is likely our final transmission. The transmission was received, but by listeners who understood that some secrets were too dangerous to acknowledge officially. Within hours, Ravens Hollow would be designated a geological hazard zone, closed to civilian access pending environmental impact studies that would never be completed. Tobias moved through the chaos with the fluid grace of someone operating in his native element, his 70 years of mountain experience compressed into instinctive knowledge of wind patterns, sound travel, and the subtle signs that indicated when humans were attempting to hide in wilderness areas. He'd been born into these mountains during an era when survival required skills that modern civilization had forgotten. And now, those ancient abilities were being tested against opponents who possessed every advantage except intimate knowledge of the terrain. "They're heading for the extraction point," he whispered, pointing toward a clearing where helicopter rotors were already spinning up. "Sophronia and the core family members. Gotta stop them before they disappear into the federal system." The extraction point sat on level ground that had been secretly prepared months earlier, complete with fuel caches and communication equipment that would allow network leadership to coordinate their escape while directing the destruction of all evidence. But reaching that helicopter meant crossing open ground that left them exposed to observers positioned on higher elevations. Agent Cromwell realized this was their moment, perhaps their only moment to capture living proof of the conspiracy that had already cost so many lives. The approach required crossing terrain that offered no concealment, moving through fields of fire that would expose them to trained marksmen, and confronting opponents who possessed every advantage except the element of surprise. Standard federal tactical doctrine demanded overwhelming force and extensive backup support. What they had instead was an elderly moonshiner with homemade explosives and a desperate plan that violated every rule of engagement ever written. Mountains choose their own survivors. The final confrontation lasted less than 3 minutes, but felt like hours. Sophronia Blackridge stood beside the extraction helicopter with the composed dignity of someone who'd always known this moment would eventually arrive. She carried no weapons, made no threatening gestures, and when Agent Vasquez emerged from the tree line with her service weapon drawn, Sophronia actually smiled. "Agent Vasquez," she said, her voice carrying easily over the helicopter's engine noise. "I wondered if you'd make it this far." Most people lack the commitment to see difficult things through to their conclusion. The standoff might have continued indefinitely, with federal agents lacking authority to arrest suspects they couldn't officially acknowledge investigating, and network members possessing resources to disappear into identities that had been decades in preparation. But Tobias Ravenston had lived through too many mountain wars to allow this one to end in stalemate. His final explosive charge brought down the entire eastern face of the mountain, creating a rock slide that engulfed the extraction point, buried the helicopter, and sealed the valley's primary access road under millions of tons of stone. When the dust settled, Ravens Hollow had been transformed from a remote mountain community into an inaccessible geological monument that would discourage visitors for generations. Official records show that geological instability claimed 17 lives during a routine federal survey operation in October 1978. Agents David Cromwell and Elena Vasquez were listed among the casualties, their deaths attributed to tragic timing during a natural disaster that couldn't have been predicted or prevented. But some federal agents are harder to kill than official paperwork suggests. The two survivors who eventually walked out of those mountains 3 days later carried secrets that would never appear in any government file, along with evidence that was immediately classified and buried so deep within the federal bureaucracy that it became effectively invisible. They'd learned that some conspiracies are too large to prosecute, too dangerous to expose, and too well connected to challenge through conventional legal channels. Ravens Hollow remains closed to civilian access, officially due to ongoing geological instability and environmental contamination from historical mining operations. But locals claim that on certain nights, when the mountain mist is thick and the moon is dark, you can still hear voices echoing from the sealed valleys, the sounds of families calling to each other across distances that can't be crossed by any living soul. They say Sophronia Blackridge's voice is the clearest of all, still giving orders that no one can hear, but everyone obeys. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.